Imagine being born into endless gold, power and luxury, only to die beneath the cold steel of the guillotine. This is the tragic story of Louis XVI of France, a king who began his life inside the glittering halls of Versailles, but lost it all in the blood and fire of the French Revolution. He wasn't just dethroned. He was betrayed, humiliated and dragged before thousands of his own people to face a death no king had ever imagined. From the whispers of famine to the storming of the Bastille, from failed escape to the blade that ended it all. This is how the last king of France went through the very worst fate of all. If you love dark history and untold true stories, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what's coming next. Louis Auguste was born in 1754 inside the glittering halls of the Palace of Versailles, a place that seemed more like a dream than a home. Chandeliers sparkled with thousands of candles, mirrors reflected endless golden light, and servants bowed so low that their foreheads nearly touched the floor. But behind all that grandeur, the boy who would one day be known as Louis XVI was quiet, shy, and awkward. He was not the fiery, commanding prince that France expected. He was hesitant, soft-spoken, and often lost in thought. From his earliest years, Louis was shadowed by the weight of his destiny. He was the grandson of the great Louis XV, and as the heir, people whispered that he would one day wear the crown of the most powerful kingdom in Europe. France was a nation of glittering wealth, unmatched culture, and armies feared across the continent. But it was also a kingdom drowning in debt, famine, and unrest. And so, even as a boy, Louis was unknowingly being prepared to inherit not just a crown, but a crumbling empire. Unlike many princes, Louis didn't enjoy loud court games or political intrigues. He preferred hunting, locksmithing, and reading. He could spend hours tinkering with metal locks or studying maps, rather than charming courtiers with sharp wit and clever words. To the powerful nobles who surrounded him, Louis seemed more like a gentle craftsman than a future king. And yet, history was already moving toward him like a storm he could never avoid. At age 15, Louis was married to Marie Antoinette, a 14-year-old Austrian archduchess. Their marriage was meant to seal the bond between France and Austria, two powerful nations that had once been bitter enemies. But while the marriage glittered with ceremony, the young couple themselves were nervous, inexperienced, and unsure of one another. Versailles watched their every move, whispering about their shyness, their awkward silences, and their lack of heirs. To the court, marriage was not about love. It was about politics, appearances, and producing the next king. While Louis grew into adulthood, France itself was sinking deeper into crisis. The kingdom's economy was failing. Wars had drained the treasury, harvests were poor, and bread, the very food that kept peasants alive, was becoming too expensive for ordinary families. In the palaces, life went on with music, silk, and feasts. But in the villages and cities, mothers went hungry so their children could eat crusts of stale bread. The people began to murmur that their rulers were blind to suffering. Louis, shy and uncertain, did not yet realize how soon he would be thrust into the center of this storm. In 1774, when his grandfather Louis XV died, the young man of just 20 years became King Louis XVI of France. The boy who once preferred silence and locks now wore the crown of a kingdom on the brink of collapse. And though he could not know it, his reign would end not in glory, but beneath the blade of the guillotine. The Palace of Versailles was unlike any place in the world. Stretching across acres of marble, gardens, fountains, and gold, it was a world designed to remind everyone that the king and queen were more than human. They were symbols of glory itself. For Louis XVI, Versailles was a place of safety, a cage of elegance where every problem of the kingdom seemed far away. But for the people of France, Versailles became the ultimate image of their suffering. At the heart of that image stood Marie Antoinette, the young queen. Blonde, charming, and full of energy, she loved theater, fashion, and music. She hosted lavish balls where gowns glittered with diamonds, and she built her own private paradise, the Petit Trianon, a miniature estate where she and her friends could play at being shepherdesses, far from the pressures of the court. For many in Versailles, Marie Antoinette was the jewel of France. But for the starving masses outside its golden gates, she was something else. A villain. As bread prices rose and hunger spread, rumors about the Queen began to circulate like wildfire. Some said she held secret feasts while children in Paris went to bed crying from hunger. Others claimed she mocked the poor and wasted fortunes on dresses, jewels, and parties. The most infamous rumor, that when told the people had no bread, she sneered, "Let them eat cake," was never truly said by her. But it didn't matter. The people believed it, and it became her curse. Louis XVI, meanwhile, struggled in silence. He was not a cruel man. In fact, he genuinely wished to be a good king. He lowered taxes on the poor, tried to reform the legal system, and even supported the American colonies in their war of independence, hoping to weaken Britain, France's old enemy. But his generosity came at a terrible cost. The war drained the French treasury. By the 1780s, France was drowning in debt, and the king's ministers whispered of bankruptcy. Still, life at Versailles glittered on. The court expected its king and queen to appear endlessly rich, endlessly perfect. If Louis cancelled a festival or Marie wore a gown without jewels, the nobility whispered of weakness. So the show went on, fireworks, operas, banquets. But each golden candle in Versailles was another spark of rage in Paris. By 1785, a scandal broke that would ruin Marie Antoinette's reputation forever. The affair of the diamond necklace. Though she had no part in the crime, her name was tied to a plot involving a stolen diamond necklace worth millions. Pamphlets across France painted her as greedy, immoral, and cruel. To the starving poor, the story fit perfectly. While they begged for bread, their queen was accused of drowning in jewels. The truth was more complicated. Marie was careless, yes, but she was also a scapegoat. The real problem was France itself. A nation with too much pride, too much debt, and too much pain boiling just beneath the surface. And as the 1780s turned into the 1790s, that pain would explode into fire, tearing Versailles apart forever. It began with a spark. By 1789, France was collapsing under the weight of its debts. Bread prices doubled, then tripled. Mothers stood in endless bakery lines only to return home with nothing. Fathers struggled to keep their families alive on scraps. Hunger became anger, and anger turned to fury. For centuries, France had been ruled by kings who were obeyed without question. But now, the people began to demand something unthinkable, a voice. When Louis XVI called together the Estates General, a gathering of nobles, clergy, and commoners, to solve the kingdom's financial crisis, the commoners refused to bow to tradition. Instead, they declared themselves the National Assembly, the true representatives of the French people. Louis hesitated. Should he crush them with soldiers, or should he listen? As he wavered, the people of Paris decided for him. On July 14, 1789, a mob stormed the Bastille, a prison that symbolized royal tyranny. They tore it down brick by brick, their shouts echoing through the city. Liberty! Equality! Brotherhood! The French Revolution had begun. At Versailles, the royal family tried to continue life as normal. The mirrors still sparkled, the fountains still danced, but the air was heavy with dread. Marie Antoinette, once adored, was now mocked as Madame Deficit. Pamphlets painted her as a bloodthirsty witch, laughing while children starved. Louis, paralyzed by indecision, tried to grant reforms, ending feudal privileges, promising rights, but it was too little. Too late. In October of that same year, Paris erupted again. Thousands of women, starving and furious, marched from Paris to Versailles in the rain. They carried knives, muskets, even clubs, chanting for bread and the Queen's blood. When they stormed into the palace, Marie Antoinette barely escaped with her life, fleeing through hidden corridors as revolutionaries broke into her chambers. By morning, the mob surrounded the palace, shouting for the king and queen to return to Paris. And so, the once golden monarchs of France were forced to leave Versailles forever. Their carriage rolled slowly toward the capital, surrounded by a sea of revolutionaries waving pikes and banners. Versailles, the jewel of kings, was left silent and hollow, a ghost of its former glory. In Paris, Louis XVI was no longer a king in command. He was a prisoner of his own people. The Palace of Versailles had been his stage of power. But now, inside the walls of the Tuileries Palace, he lived under watchful eyes, every move judged, every word twisted. Still, deep inside, Louis clung to hope. He believed the storm might pass, that the people would calm, that compromise could still save his throne. But outside the palace gates, revolution was only gaining strength, and the tide was turning toward violence. And soon, the King of France would face a choice that would seal his fate forever: escape or die. By 1791, the gilded cage of the Tuileries Palace had become unbearable. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were kings in name only, watched day and night by guards, their every step reported to the people of Paris. The once mighty monarchs of France were now prisoners, humiliated before the very subjects who had once bowed at their feet, but Louis still believed he could save his crown. In secret, he began planning an escape. If he could reach the loyal fortress of Montmédy near the border, he would be protected by royalist troops. From there, he could negotiate or even crush the revolution with foreign allies. For months, he and Marie Antoinette plotted their flight, whispering in candlelit chambers, hiding letters in corsets, and placing their trust in a handful of loyal servants. On the night of June 20th, 1791, the royal family slipped out of the Tuileries in disguise. Louis dressed as a servant, Marie as a governess, their children as simple peasants. They climbed into a heavy, decorated carriage, far too large and slow for stealth, and rolled quietly out of Paris. The Queen's heart pounded as the city's lights faded behind them. For the first time in years, freedom seemed possible, but fate was not on their side. The journey was agonizingly slow. Horses tired, wheels cracked, and every village they passed whispered rumors of the fleeing royals. Louis himself betrayed them. His tall frame, awkward manner, and nervous glances made him recognizable to anyone who had ever seen his face on a coin. Near the town of Varennes, their luck ran out. A local postmaster, suspicious of the family, stopped the carriage. Villagers gathered, holding lanterns high, staring at the faces inside. And then, in a moment of dreadful recognition, someone cried out, "It's the king!" The crowd swelled with anger. Revolutionaries dragged the royal family from their carriage. Soldiers who might once have protected their monarchs now escorted them back to Paris as prisoners. The journey back was a nightmare. Along the roads, peasants jeered, spat, and shouted insults. Once people had cheered Louis as a symbol of France's glory. Now, they mocked him as a traitor, a coward, a king who had tried to abandon his people. When they returned to Paris, the scene was even worse. A silent, furious crowd lined the streets as the royal family's carriage rolled past. No cheers, no music, only cold, hateful stares. To the revolution, Louis had revealed his true face. Not a king of the people, but a king who would betray them to save himself. The flight to Varennes, as history would call it, shattered the last fragments of Louis's authority. From that day forward, he was no longer seen as the father of his nation. He was a traitor king, and in the blood-stained tide of revolution, there was only one fate for traitors. By 1792, the revolution had consumed France. The monarchy was finished, the Palace of Versailles stood abandoned, and Paris was a city of fire, fear, and fury. Louis XVI, once crowned in glory, now lived as a prisoner in the grim temple prison with Marie Antoinette and their children. His crown was gone, his throne was gone. He was no longer King of France. To the revolutionaries, he was now simply citizen capé, stripped of his title, his dignity, and his future. But the revolution demanded more than humiliation. It demanded blood. That winter, Louis was placed on trial before the National Convention, accused of treason against the people of France. The evidence was damning: secret letters, plots with foreign monarchs, and of course his attempted escape at Varennes. When asked to defend himself, Louis spoke with calm dignity. He insisted he had always loved his people, that he had acted only to protect them. But the chamber had already made its decision. On January 15, 1793, the convention voted Louis XVI was guilty. A few days later, they cast the second vote, his punishment. By a narrow margin, The verdict was death. The morning of January 21st, 1793 dawned grey and bitterly cold. Louis was led from his cell, dressed in a simple white shirt. He embraced his confessor, whispered a final prayer, and climbed into a carriage. The streets of Paris were filled with soldiers and citizens, their faces grim, their voices silent. The man who had once been the most powerful king in Europe now rode to his death like a criminal. At the Place de la Révolution, the guillotine stood tall, its blade glinting in the pale light. Drums thundered to drown out any cries of sympathy as Louis stepped from the carriage. He tried to speak, raising his voice to declare his innocence, to forgive his enemies, to pray for France. But the drums grew louder, drowning him in noise. The executioners seized him, bound his hands, and forced him beneath the blade. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze, the air thick with silence, the crowd holding its breath. And then, with a single crash of steel, the blade fell. The king's head dropped into the basket. A roar erupted from the crowd, wild and deafening. Some cheered, some wept. Others dipped handkerchiefs in his blood as souvenirs. From the palace of Versailles to the dirt of the guillotine, Louis XVI's journey was complete. He was the king who went through the worst, betrayed, imprisoned, stripped of everything, and executed by the very people he had once sworn to protect. And in that moment, as the drums still echoed and the blade dripped red, a new world was born, one that would haunt France for generations. And so the Sun King's great-grandson, born into the finest palace in the world, ended his life not on a throne, but under a blade. The revolution that claimed Louis XVI did not just destroy a king. It shattered centuries of monarchy and forever changed the destiny of France. His fall reminds us how quickly glory can turn to dust, how even the most powerful can lose everything when the voices of the people rise. History is not just about dates and battles. It is about human lives, dreams, mistakes, betrayals, and tragedies that still echo today. If you found this story haunting and powerful, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who love history, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next dark tale from the past.